Hello, I'm Dr. Stephen Hassan with another episode of the Influence Continuum. And in this period of time before the 2024 elections, there are some very important topics that I want everyone to learn and understand how this election is probably the most consequential presidential election in over 80 years. And the importance of citizens understanding issues is of monumental importance. And so when I was approached to interview my next guest, Amanda Tyler, and about her forthcoming book, How to End Christian Nationalism, forgive me for hesitating, How to End Christian Nationalism. This is a topic we've talked about many times, about efforts to destroy the separation of church and state, and Seven Mountains Dominionism and New Apostolic Reformation and other efforts like this. When I learned Amanda Tyler is actually a lawyer and the executive director of the Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty, I was like, I want to talk to Amanda and get to know her and her good work, because I'm a believer in God. I'm for spirituality and religious freedom 100%, but I don't want other people using religion to end other people's religious freedom. And it sounds like we're on the same page, Amanda. So,
Absolutely.
Amanda, let's just start. Could you tell people your background and how you came to become the executive director for the Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty? And then we'll get into your new book and what you want to share with my listeners.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's wonderful to be with you, Stephen. My background, personally and religiously, I am a Baptist. I'm a Baptist lay leader. I've been a Baptist my whole life, growing up in churches in Texas, baptized as a 7-year-old when I made a personal profession of faith. And it's just been such a motivating part of my life for my entire life. But alongside that track was this deep interest in law and politics that came to me at a very early age. And I'm the first member of my family to be a lawyer, to go to law school. I went to the University of Texas School of Law, which is also my hometown of Austin, Texas. And after law school, I first went into private practice. And then I went to work for a member of Congress for 8 years. So I served as his district director in Texas, and then as his Ways and Means Counsel on Capitol Hill. But also throughout this period, starting when I was in college at Georgetown University, I became involved and engaged in the work of the Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty. So just a quick word about BJC. We are an 88-year-old advocacy and education organization headquartered on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C., and our mission is faith freedom for all. We are a faith-based Baptist organization, but we advocate for everyone's religious freedom. And we believe that in our American context, the only way to ensure everyone's religious freedom is to protect the separation of church and state. That defending those First Amendment principles of no establishment and free exercise is the only way to ensure everyone's religious freedom. And so for most of our history, our work has been advocacy in DC with Congress and before the U.S. Supreme Court, filing friend of the court briefs. But over the last several years, we have come to know that advocacy alone is not going to protect religious freedom. And we really need to be concentrating on some of the most urgent threats to religious freedom. And I believe the most urgent threat to a religious freedom in America today is the rise of Christian nationalism. And so we have really devoted many of our efforts over the last several years to leading a campaign called Christians Against Christian Nationalism. And that is what led me to write my forthcoming book, How to End Christian Nationalism.
I was going to ask you to hold up the book
Here
and
it is. It
thank
comes out
you.
October 22nd,
If
but
you're
I've got a copy
listening
here.
to this, you can look at the video on our YouTube and see the cover of the book. But now you need to explain, what is Christian nationalism for those who are listening who may need to have a definition?
Yes. So the definition I use in the book and that we've used at the campaign is this one. Christian nationalism is a political ideology and a cultural framework that tries to merge American and Christian identities. And so by my definition, I'm talking about Christian nationalism in an American context. I think we also think about religious nationalism more broadly as the merging of any religious and national identity. And that's been a recurrent problem throughout history and around the world today.
Yeah, let's look at the Afghan government, for example. Muslims have taken over and taken away women's rights and the freedom to read and be educated for women. And
Absolutely. Or we can look at Putin's Russia and the use
yes.
of the Orthodox Church as a proxy for the Russian government and as a means for exclusion. So many different examples of religious nationalism around the world. But, really zeroing in on the American context, Christian nationalism tells the story that to be a true American, that one has to be a Christian. And not just any kind of Christian, but a certain kind of Christian who holds fundamentalist religious beliefs that are often in line with certain conservative political priorities. And right there in the name of Christian nationalism, it really is a heavy reliance on this mythological history of the United States as a quote unquote Christian nation. Not in a demographic sense or a descriptive sense, but rather this mythology that America was created by Christians in order to favor Christianity in law and policy. And so we see that expressed in an idea that God's providential hand has been guiding America throughout history and that God has a special role for America in God's plan for the world. Some parts of the ideology even hold that our founding documents are divinely inspired, rejecting the idea that these are secular documents, and instead trying to say that they represent or somehow trying to further Christian values, or sometimes this strange term of Judeo-Christian values. I say strange because there is no such religion as Judeo-Christianity.
Right. I'm Jewish, by the way, our point of view is Jesus was a Jew, and I cite Harvey Cox's book, Common Prayers, that Jesus was a Jew. So if Christians want to understand Jesus, they should understand what Judaism teaches. And a big thing is the need to question authority. And if I may take 1 minute, I'll just say, I've been helping people get out of religious cults, Jewish, Christian, Muslim, Buddhist, Hindu cults for decades. But with the Abrahamic religions, I always like to go back to the Garden of Eden myth or story from the Bible. Then I say, if Almighty God didn't brainwash Adam and Eve to be obedient, doesn't that tell us something about the divine that God wants us to follow out of faith and not out of coercion? So
Absolutely.
as a lawyer, I couldn't resist adding that in for you.
Well, absolutely. And it's very similar when I talk about the ideas of religious freedom really coming from some of the ideas of religious freedom coming from a biblical place. I do go back to that first creation story in the book of Genesis, and I talk about the way that God created free beings.
Yes.
That God could have created robots, right?
Yes,
God could have,
wonderful.
But didn't, right? And instead, we have the freedom to say yes or no to God and the freedom to live with those consequences.
Yes.
And that means that we can't have a government that is trying to enforce faith on everyone else, because that takes away that freedom of choice to choose religion freely. It's expressed also even in my Baptist identity. One of the things that sets Baptists apart from many other Christians is something we call believer's baptism, that it means that of each individual, that you don't baptized babies because babies aren't able to make that free choice to be
Right.
baptized, but rather you wait until someone is able to make that choice on their own. So many different biblical foundations here. But, back to that idea of Judeo-Christian values, which is kind of, to me, a sign of Christian nationalism. It reduces Judaism to a modifier of Christianity. It
Yeah.
denigrates the beautiful religion of Judaism to make it just kind of this add-on or this precursor to what became Christianity. And so in this kind of maybe strange way to try to be inclusive, it is actually quite exclusive.
I'm
And
so glad
again,
to hear you
yeah,
talking about this and so explicitly. And I abhor Christian nationalists using the shofar, where the Jews we're having Rosh Hashanah now, the beginning of the new year, and the reboot, the spiritual reboot that we do yearly, and they're trying to co-opt, Torah stories and take things from the Old Testament to justify their bad behaviors today.
yeah. I mean, we saw, yes, the example of the blowing of the shofar and also the use of these Jericho marches
Right.
in the days leading up to the January 6th insurrection. Yes, co-opting religious symbols, religious language for political ends. And I think that is a way that, regardless of religious background, we can see how religion is used as a prop for Christian nationalism in a way that really harms authentic faith. And it is that drive of co-opting, and in the case of Christian nationalism, using Jesus as a mascot. Yes,
Yeah.
Jesus was a Jew. That is correct. That
Well, they're
is
trying to make Trump into Jesus now too. It's really upsetting. But
yeah.
but
And that
it's
merger, yes, the messianic language around Trump is an example of the merger of political and religious authority, which leads to idolatry, right? That would cause us to worship a political leader or worship government over worship of God. And so these are all reasons for religious people and for me as a Christian that it is exactly my Christian faith which has motivated me to speak out against Christian nationalism, as well as my patriotism as an American, my belief in religious freedom for all people, and the importance and the
right.
genius of separation of church and state as a way to protect and preserve a pluralistic democracy and actually build more religious diversity in our culture. So it is both of those identities, not one and the same, but two separate identities that have caused me to take on this cause of
Right.
trying to dismantle Christian nationalism.
Right. And so, can I ask you a leading question? What do you think of people who are self-anointed prophets and apostles who claim to speak directly to God and who claim that Trump won the 2020 election because God told them Trump won? Like, what do you say to that?
Well, we have lots of examples of false prophets throughout history, and using again this biblical language, this biblical tradition of prophecy, and to use it for these political aims is really a danger to our democracy. Part of my I guess, research for the book, but also just my work in this field led me to attend one stop on something called the Reawaken America Tour.
Oh, God, yes. Tell
So
us about it.
yeah, so this is something that started after the 2020 election. It was started by Michael Flynn, the
You're right,
disgraced former
exactly.
general, and some other business leaders, but he's really been the speaker figurehead at all these tour
And he's been
stops.
linked to QAnon, by the way, at the very beginning of Q. He apparently, we've
Yeah,
traced back forensically on Twitter to
wow.
Flynn. So please continue
I'm
about
I'm
this.
not surprised, but by that, but I had not seen that direct link myself. So,
Mm,
Reawaken America Tour is kind of this mix of Christian nationalism, election conspiracies, election denialism, COVID conspiracies, and kind of marketing and trying to sell products all rolled into one.
Mm-hmm,
And
mm-hmm,
it's traveled around the country, and at different stops, several thousand people will gather for a couple-day conference. And last year, I went to one of the tour stops when it was at a Trump property in Miami, just
mm-hmm.
to see for myself what was happening at these locations. And I saw some of these prophets. I'm putting air quotes around that.
Yes.
Prophets who were saying, God spoke to them, and God said that Trump would be president. This idea and furthering this idea is just undercutting the democratic process. In the
Mm.
United States, prophets don't determine who wins elections. Voters determine who wins elections. And
Amen, if I
so,
can use a
yes,
religious word. And
and so by inserting these false prophecies into the election discourse, it is laying the groundwork for election denialism.
mm-hmm.
And so no one knows who's going to win the 2024 election because voters haven't finished voting yet. Some
Right,
voters haven't even started voting yet.
right.
And so it is not a predetermined out result. And so when we hear these, and I've heard that it's not just people who kind of sell themselves as prophets, but it's also some political leaders. I was speaking with someone else who works in this area, Matthew D. Taylor, who's written
Oh,
quite a
I
bit.
interviewed Matthew
Oh,
and
great.
about his film, and he has a book out now as well. Please continue.
Yeah, so his book just came out as well, and he was saying he listened in to a call, was like religious leaders for Trump call, and that Speaker Johnson said on the call that he really believed, he'd been praying about, and he really believed that Trump was going to win the election. So we also see, the person who presides over the U.S. House of Representatives, the person who is second in line to the presidency, should have something happen to the president. We see that person furthering these conspiracy theories himself.
Scary.
Yeah. And so I just, it really is a danger to our free democracy to have these ideas being pushed. Again, it's not the religious beliefs themselves, but rather using religion in order to undercut free and fair elections
Right.
is an urgent threat to our democratic process.
Yeah, and if I may take a moment, I don't know if you're aware of my influence continuum that I did my doctoral dissertation on to update the law regarding undue influence, but ethical influence respects conscience, informed consent, critical thinking, the freedom to dissent, responsible leadership, checks and balances of institutions, and authoritarian religious cults basically want dependence and obedience. They're malignant narcissistic leaders. And I have a model called the BITE model of mind control that looks at behavior, information, thought, and emotional control as variables that the law can use to get off this notion that influence is a slippery slope when it comes to religion. I think legitimate religions give informed consent before they indoctrinate people. They don't sleep deprive them. They don't manipulate them through phobias and guilt trips and forced, psychological indoctrination. So that, forgive my rant, but that's where I come from. Like, faith should be faith. It should be love-based, not fear-based. It should be bringing people together, not creating identity divisions and attacking people as vermin and as objects, which is what I'm hearing more and more from
Yeah,
this.
I completely agree with you and share those ideas of the kind of faith that I have and that I want to share with other people and that I think leads to a flourishing life.
Yeah,
And here's the thing about religious freedom. Because of free exercise in this country, all different kinds of religious traditions, including those that tend to the authoritarian way of thinking, are permitted and allowed. But what's not allowed is for any of those traditions to take over the government and
right.
impose their way of understanding and following God on everyone else. And that's where we are really on the precipice, I think, of moving from a pluralistic democracy that protects and should protect everyone's religious freedom into this very dangerous area of authoritarian theocracy.
Right.
And we see it on the national level, but I live in Texas. We're starting to see it on the state and local level already.
Yep.
And where we see, this well-funded and highly organized political movement making a power play to take over the instruments of government and to try to impose this authoritarian fundamentalist faith on everyone else.
Yep. And I think there's overwhelming evidence that Putin is very involved in funding and in psychological warfare, mimetic warfare on social media platforms for his own agenda. He wants his billions of dollars released that have been frozen because of the Magnitsky Act. He wants no regulations on fossil fuels because that's his primary income. And so the whole fossil fuel, countries and corporations are pushing Trump and this agenda. And so can you tell us some more about your organization, the Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty, and also more action steps if people are listening? What can they do? How can they support you and your efforts?
Yeah. So I mentioned that BJC, we are this coalition of different Baptist denominational groups and churches and individuals, many of whom are Baptists, but not all are Baptists. People from different Christian traditions, different faith traditions, and people who don't claim a faith tradition, but believe in what we do. And that is to kind of continue this Baptist heritage of standing up for religious freedom for all people. I might just kind of veer a little into a history lesson.
Please.
A lot of your listeners might be surprised to learn that protecting and defending the separation of church and state has actually been part of what makes a Baptist for over 400 years. I say that might be surprising because I think most people, when they hear Baptist, they think about the Southern Baptist Convention. And over the last several decades, the Southern Baptist Convention has become, as an organization, more and more caught up in this Christian nationalist movement that is not representative of the whole of Baptist movement and the history of Baptists. So Baptists started in the early 17th century in Europe, both in the Netherlands, but also in England. And the co-founder of the Baptist movement was a man named Thomas Helwys. He was a lawyer. He was not a preacher. He was a lay leader. But he wrote a short pamphlet called A Short Declaration, The Mystery of Iniquity. And it is thought to be the first defense of universal religious freedom in the English language. And he sent a copy of his writing to King James I, as in the King James Bible, someone who had a thorough merger of church and state in the Church of England, being the head of the Church of England. And he sent this document, which basically said that a religion is between a person and God, and the king shouldn't answer for it. So very bold advocacy to this theocratic leader in King James. And Thomas Helwys was arrested for his advocacy, and he died while he was in prison. And so I tell this story to say, the co-founder of the Baptist movement gave his life in part for the defense of religious freedom for all people. And then I also can point to Roger Williams, who really spent his entire life as a seeker of different faiths, but spent some important time as a Baptist because he founded the first Baptist church in America. And he is also well known for his defense of religious freedom for all people. And in fact, he wrote, way back in the 17th century about a hedge of separation between the garden of the church and the wilderness of the state. It was, some of the same separationist language that continues to the modern day was also written by Roger Williams.
This is fascinating to me, and I guess I just want to react and just say that my understanding was Martin Luther rebelled against the Catholic Church by saying we can have a direct relationship with God. We can read the scripture ourselves once it gets translated and published. We don't need some institution or some other person, some other human being to tell us what God wants, but we can pray, have conscience, and have our own freedom uh,
Right.
of faith.
So much of this Protestant Reformation, and then the development of other Protestant uh, sects and movements like the Baptists. I think a lot of that was kind of in the milieu at the time, right, in
Right.
Europe, and so we can see it kind of coming in these different. That's why I very carefully said the first defense of universal religious freedom in the English language is it's thought to be because there's so many different places that these ideas were coming up at the same time. But then there was another Baptist preacher back in the 18th century named John Leland, and he was why his advocacy for religious freedom was so important at the time as a Baptist was he was a neighbor of James Madison, and so a lot of his writings, his teachings were very, and the teachings and writings of other Baptists were very influential to the framers of the U.S. Constitution, to their experience of what established religion meant for those in power, for those who were part of the Church of England, later the Episcopal Church, but also for those who were not in power, people like Baptists and Presbyterians, not to mention Jewish people, smaller white Muslim population at the time, large Muslim population among the enslaved population at the time, though, which is of course completely missed when people talk about a white Christian America or America as a Christian nation, completely ignoring the religion of the enslaved population when we talk about that. So a little bit of a historical detour, but I wanted to kind of give you an idea of why is there even a Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty?
It's fascinating and important. Can you just take another few minutes for our listeners to explicitly talk about the founders of our country and the framers of the Constitution, because there is this mythology that's being promulgated that it was a Christian nation and the founders were. And so please share.
Yeah, so there's this kind of pseudo history out there about America as a Christian nation that is not a good historical analysis, right? It's rather this kind of cherry picked religious biography of the framers, which is itself not even authentic. Because someone like a Thomas Jefferson, who on his the obelisk on his grave marks as one of the three top achievements of his life was the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, right? Someone who was, I think, one of the greats in the ideas of religious freedom for this country. He himself was a deist. He, famously took his scissors to his Bible and cut out all of the miracles because in the Gospels, because he didn't believe that didn't accord with his religion. So he's certainly not he's certainly not a fundamentalist Christian in his religious beliefs. But they like to cherry pick quotes from different founders or to emphasize their Protestant religiosity as something that was important to them. Or they talk about, America as being founded for religious freedom. And they point to the Pilgrims and the Puritans for that idea, even though the Massachusetts Bay Colony became a place of extreme Christian nationalism, of extreme exclusion. In fact, Roger Williams, who I talked about earlier, was banished from the Massachusetts Bay Colony for daring to have a different religion than those in power there. So this again narrative or mythology of a Christian nation, or that the framers were trying to institute Christianity in the new country, is just completely rebuked by reading the U.S. Constitution itself, that they made a very deliberate choice to break with the past, to break from the English system, and to disestablish religion.
Hmm.
And so in the Constitution itself, the original document, there is no mention of God, there is no mention of Jesus, there is no mention of Christianity, and the only mention of religion at all is in Article 6, which prohibits religious tests for public office, right? And so I often say, you know, if the framers were really trying to create a Christian nation, this is about the most ineffective way I can possibly think to do so. To,
Mm.
from the very beginning, prohibit religious tests for public office, and to say essentially that one's religion has no bearing on one's citizenship or belonging in the United States.
Yeah, this seems like such a centrally important thing that the public is ignorant about, I think. It's just, it's tragic, I think, that people don't have an accurate understanding of our real history
Yeah.
and what people believed back then, and explicitly there should be no test. This is the opposite of the Heritage Foundation Project 2025 and what they're claiming they're going to do on day one if Trump gets into power again.
Yeah. And there's a very deliberate attempt right now by, again, this well-funded Christian nationalist movement to have this narrative of America as a Christian nation replace a more accurate telling of American history or even a reading of the Constitution. And so we see in Florida, we see in my state of Texas, efforts to in Oklahoma in the way that they're trying to incorporate the Bible into understanding of civics or government that really is just undercutting all of the constitutional principles in the process. And so in my new book, I have an entire chapter kind of on one of the ways of dismantling Christian nationalism is to understand better how separation of church and state and religious freedom work together. So, it's not a law book, but that is probably the most law-centric chapter of the book, because I think it's really important that every American kind of has this basic civics education. And tragically, public schools are not providing in some states in this country by design. They are not teaching civics in that way anymore.
Yeah, and I interviewed the founder of a very important organization called iCivics.org that Sandra Day O'Connor helped to found, and has these courses for free to give out to anyone who wants to learn, and curriculum in those public schools that are willing to implement it, because we need educated citizens to have a democracy that works.
Absolutely, and we see a really concerted effort to not have that education for citizens, and there's another whole chapter in my book about how Christian nationalism is being pushed in public schools, because that is a part of the strategy for this authoritarian takeover. That we both to defund public schools and try to push more public funding into private education, including private religious education, but at the same time, in the public schools themselves, to roll back decades of work,
Right.
bipartisan work, by the way,
Right.
to protect religious freedom of all people in public schools, allowing free exercise, of course, in ways that don't interfere with the educational school day, but also ensuring that the government is not pushing any religion on the students in public schools. And so we see efforts to teach the Bible as authoritative text or as fact to children as young as kindergarten.
Right. The Earth is 6,000 years old, despite all the science that says it's 4 billion years old, for example.
Right, to try to teach creationism alongside evolution just is, two different theories, and you can pick between the two of them. To have government sponsored religious exercise or prayer, kind of returning, or the posting of the Ten Commandments in public school
Right.
classrooms, as we've seen in the state of Louisiana already passed. And also the use of chaplains, unlicensed chaplains in public schools, in some cases, even to replace school counselors.
Yeah, that's
So
frightening.
so many threats to the public schools. And so I think, and public schools impact us all, whether we have children in public schools now or not. All of our tax dollars support public schools. And when 90% of Americans continue to be educated in public schools, we all have a vested interest in making sure that these government institutions remain places where everyone's religious freedom is respected and protected.
Right. So I'm sure you're advocating people get involved locally with school boards and really understand what's happening in your state, in your community. And tell us more about what you think our listeners can do, before the election and after the election, no matter whether Harris or Trump is elected. What do you see?
Yeah. So, of course, the election is front and center for us. And I want to talk about things there. I do want to say at the beginning, though, no matter what happens up and down the ballot in November, Christian nationalism is going to continue to be a major issue and a threat beyond. It's been
Agreed.
long-standing problem. It is going to be multi-generations to do the work that I'm setting out about trying to end Christian nationalism. But in the lead up to the election, I think it's really vital, of course, that we all support free and fair elections, that we vote, that we help other people to vote, that when we hear kind of these election conspiracies or these false prophecies about God preordaining an election result, that we stand against them. And particularly those of us who are Christian. I think that we all have a role to play. But because Christians and people who claim a Christian identity are still a majority in this country, and continue to hold enormous privilege in this country because of all of the ways that Christianity is kind of taken as, a given in so many different circles, we have the greatest responsibility to call out Christian nationalism when we see it. And so to really be watching for those opportunities in the lead up to the election. I mean, another example, are people who say, because you are a Christian, you must vote for or against a given candidate. And we hear it from both parties. And so I just want to reject that kind of thinking altogether.
Good.
That your religious values and your moral values, you don't have to be religious to be moral, of course, that all of those values, I think, can and should inform the way that you vote. But no candidate is perfectly aligned with any religion or set of religious or moral values. If it is, then we're not worshiping God. We're worshiping a political party or a political platform or a person. And so to really try to separate our religious and our political identities, one can inform the other.
Right.
Hopefully your religion's informing your politics and your politics aren't informing your religion. But they're not one and the same thing. And then I think like so many other people, are really concerned with what happens after the election. Especially if Harris wins the election, that there will be another attempt to undermine that election result by claiming that there was fraud when there was no fraud, by basically saying, again, if anything but Trump wins, that somehow it's illegitimate.
Yeah, Trump's been setting that up again, like he did before the 16 election and the 2020 election. Yeah. And if I may just add, I interviewed, have you ever heard of Braver Angels organization? Yes. So I interviewed the two co-chairs in a previous podcast because they did a project on what would be a free and fair election with the people leaning blue and leaning red. And they came up with a document of what what changes need to be made and what they're looking for, that I think was not getting enough press. It's really important stuff because it's
That's fantastic.
bipartisan.
Yeah, I'll check that document out. I'm familiar and really respect the work of Braver Angels, and think that, that is such an important project. This idea of having conversations with people who vote differently,
Right,
because with rampant polarization, we just are being further pulled and pulled apart just by who we vote for,
right.
and that really undercuts again this whole democratic project that we are about. That if our democracy is to survive, then we need to be able to go through free and fair and safe elections. The use of political violence, of course, is an incredibly dangerous development, and what we've really seen ramping up for the last several years. And I'll point back to January 6th. I mean, something we haven't talked about really in
Please.
this conversation
Very
is,
important topic. Yes.
is how Christian nationalism was used to really ignite and intensify that violence at the Capitol on January 6th. At the top of our conversation, we talked about the Jericho marches, but these were these lead up rallies in
Yep.
the months before in the weeks before January 6th, to try to build more and more support, and to organize people to show up to actually try to overthrow the results of the election. And so, at Baptist Joint Committee, we had been leading the Christians Against Christian Nationalism project at that point for 18 months. And so I was immediately recognized those symbols, not as
Wow.
Christian symbols, but as symbols of Christian nationalism, of using the scriptures and the images of Jesus and the other Christian symbols like crosses, and trying to use those as a permission structure for the violence that was, and trying to normalize or to give it some kind of cultural currency, that God was the reason that they were there, that they were just fulfilling God's will. And so if there is a similar challenge to this year's
I
election
think that's
results.
probable, as probability is high. And I just want to add, people like Steve Bannon and Roger Stone and Alex Jones, they don't believe in God. They're just cynically using believers for their chaos goals and financial and political goals.
That's right. It's incredibly cynical, and it is also incredibly offensive to those of us who are Christians, to see our faith being used this way and manipulated, and that this idea of Christian nationalism is totally antithetical to the teachings in the life of Jesus, as I understand it. Jesus, who was always on the side of the oppressed and the marginalized, and who himself was killed for speaking truth to power.
Mm.
He is nothing about Christian nationalism. He's nothing about this idol of power, and using earthly means to secure justice and righteousness for all people, regardless of nationality. And so to see Jesus being used for these political aims is really offensive to
And
so
forgive
many
me,
Christians.
but didn't Jesus say, like, render unto Caesar what's Caesar, or it's harder for a rich person to enter the kingdom of heaven? Didn't he say explicit things? Um,
Yes. Yeah, so exactly. In the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus has this teaching where the Pharisees and the Herodians are trying to trick him, and they say, is it lawful to pay taxes to the emperor or not? And Jesus says, render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, render unto God the things that are God's. I mean,
mm,
I cite that scripture as an example of the seeds of this idea of separation of church and state, that
yeah.
God is not Caesar and Caesar is not God. And, that Jesus, I think, in that was saying, yes, we do have some responsibilities of citizenship,
Yeah.
including paying taxes, but that those are different allegiances and responsibilities than the responsibilities that we owe to God. And
Mm-hmm.
that I think what's unstated there, but I believe, but our allegiances to God are more important. And so
Mm,
when those come into conflict with our responsibilities as citizenship, then we're given a choice to make about
mm,
which one of those we are going to be, that we are going to hold above the other. And sometimes the state's not going to like our choice, and we're going to be held responsible in some way by the state for those choices.
mm.
But that's a free choice, and a choice that means living according to the dictates of our faith and religion.
Right. Um, I'm so glad to know you and know that your organization is out there. And I feel as as a Jew, I am limited in what I can share of what I know of the New Testament. But I've learned a lot about. I've done a lot of cases with Christian Bible cults, so I work with ministers and seminary trained theologians to help counsel people who get caught up in these mind control cults. And it just seems like your voice is so central to ending Christian nationalism and the same kinds of truth claims that they're making, and you saying, no, no, that's a mythology. Sorry, that's not what Jesus is teaching. It's very important that people of faith really share their faith and just say it to people who are caught up in this Christian nationalist, dominionist, and New Apostolic Reformation movement, where they're following individuals who are like, "Give me money, give me more money. You'll be blessed 10 times if you give me more money. I need another jet." And it's like, and I've been saying, like, where are the Christians to go, like, no, that's not Christianity.
Right.
That's a
Right.
corruption of our faith.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, so by multiple times, the times that Jesus preached against hoarding wealth and preached about taking care of the poor, and all of those verses are completely forgotten when we get into this prosperity gospel or capitalistic impulse that is driving so many of these movements that claim religion as their core. But that kind of gets me to, I hope, an encouraging point for listeners,
Please.
because when people do public polling around how prevalent are these ideas around Christian nationalism, it is a minority point of view among the American people.
Yay.
The latest numbers from PRRI are that the most extreme, the people who do, the dominionist or want to take over, it's the smallest group of Americans. It's not an inconsequential number, unfortunately. It's about 10%. But even those who aren't quite that far, but who still have some of these ideas around Christian nationalism, it only adds about 20% to that group. So 30% kind of are in that area moving towards Christian nationalism. That leaves 70% of the rest of us, right? And
Right.
so I think part of my goal in writing the book, in the campaign Christians Against Christian Nationalism, which has signers across the country, and that we're really trying to work in building some more local groups and communities to take action on the ground. Part of our goal is to normalize talking out against Christian nationalism. There's been in some places this hesitancy because there's a fear that to speak out against Christian nationalism is somehow to speak out against Christianity. And so that's also where I think it's really incumbent on other Christians to be taking a leading role in speaking out against Christian nationalism,
Yep.
because we can speak most authentically about how it's a distortion of
Exactly.
Christianity itself. And so that's kind of like both leading up to the election, but in the months to come, if we can just speak more and more, call out Christian nationalism when we see it, and then also be trying to build the kind of society that we want. We have serious problems at the national level with the U.S. Supreme Court and with Congress.
Yeah.
And depending on, what happens in November with the presidency as well. But it's really up to we, the people, to build the kind of democratic society that we want to have. And so how do we support religious freedom for all people in all of our local communities, in our families, in our neighborhoods, in our public schools, in our cities, and at our state government. And that's what I'm really hoping through the book and through working with this much larger movement of people who care about this issue, that we will continue to make progress in this area.
Fantastic. And I'll just say that there's a lot of money being pushed to amplify these extremist points of view on the left too, not just the right, this authoritarian extremist stuff. But as you say correctly, the vast 70% of us are in the middle who just want to have like leaders who are honest, with integrity, who are fit to put our needs over their personal ego needs or their personal bank account needs, like real come back to values that,
Yeah.
are so essential. And I just want to call out this extreme libertarian nihilistic ideology of Ayn Rand and selfishness is good and altruism is evil. This is satanic. If I believed in Satan, I would say this is evil. This is like not how the human species has evolved to be as successful as we are. We help each other. We cooperate with each other.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think at our best, we haven't always lived up to it, but I hope at our best, Americans can kind of tap into that spirit of building community as well. And especially as we grow in diversity in all different ways as Americans, this real opportunity that we have to live into some of these ideals that have never been fully realized before, that this can provide. We're at a moment, I think, where the entire project of American democracy is really in jeopardy. And so it's also a moment that calls on all of us to step up in ways that maybe we haven't really thought necessary before. This is our time to step up, to be more actively involved, in voting, in getting more involved on the civic level in between elections, in organizing with our neighbors and getting to know our neighbors, coming out of our isolation, whether it be, just this individualistic idea or social media or whatever it is that's kind of driving this isolation, that we really get to know our neighbors again and come together for the good of us all. And
Yes.
really understanding that mutuality of existence that we all have. I'm by nature an optimistic person, by faith a hopeful person, and so I kind of view this as a great challenge, but also an enormous opportunity for us all to really fulfill these ideals.
Yeah, fantastic. And as a mental health expert, I just want to say humans have not evolved to be on cell phones 10 hours a day. And these are pixels. This is not real.
Yeah.
Real people in real life are friends. Followers who are anonymous, who may be bots or agents from another country, are not the same thing as real people that we live with. And we need to rethink, the role of this versus being in the world in real life and hugging people and praying together and believing and doing services together and just helping each other in very real ways and not just existing in pixel land.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. That's so well said. And for people who are in religious communities or want to be in religious communities, they can provide a wonderful outlet for that human connection, human support, someone who will show up for you in your times of greatest celebration and times of greatest grief as well. It's certainly been true in my life, and I know in the lives of so many other people. And so also having an opportunity to reclaim that, whether people find it in a particular religious or spiritual dimension or in other areas of connection, I think that is such an important
Agreed.
piece of
Yeah,
a
no,
response
I'm
here.
friends with humanists, and they get together, and they're really
Yeah.
nice people, and they may not believe as I believe, but I think of Greg Epstein, who was the Harvard humanist chaplain who wrote a book, Good Without God. And he was saying there's a lot of good about religion, about rituals and community, and you can be good and you can have a conscience without worrying about an afterlife,
Yeah.
et cetera, and all that good stuff. Amanda Tyler, so hold up your book again. It is a very important book, How to End Christian Nationalism. And as you correctly say, I agree with you. This is going to be an issue for decades in the future. This is not going away after the election. And so, therefore, I think we want to, wrap this up with hope and encouraging people who may be feeling really down or like, oh, we're going down the tubes. No, 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 no. And we don't have an option to fail, in my opinion. We don't want to be living in a China or a Russia, a version of either of these authoritarian cults, dictatorship cults. So we have to think long term. What can we do within our power, within our resources, network with good people who have real credentials, have demonstrated they're walking the walk and they're not just saying good things, but they have a track record. Like experts matter,
Yeah.
science matters.
Absolutely. And I feel that hope when I'm out talking about this issue. I've been out, out at speaking events for the last several years talking about this issue, and just the amount of interest and energy that people have around doing something is really inspiring. And then as this book comes out later this month, and for the next several months, I'll be doing a book tour. So if people want to go to endchristiannationalism.com, you can see places. I might be coming to your community if you want to come
Fantastic.
out and be in person with other people who care about this issue. And at each stop, we are really going to be partnering with local groups on the ground who can give a call to action, a way to be engaged right now in this work. It's wonderful to read books. I hope people will read and buy my
Right.
book. But it's also, the book is all about being kind of a pathway to engagement, and being more involved in your local community. So
Yeah,
I
that's
hope people will join
fantastic.
me.
It was End Christian Nationalism
And endchristiannationalism.com is the
.com.
website. Yeah.
Okay, so we're going to have a blog. We're going to add that link. I'd love you to give us the link for the one of the co-founders with the letter that he wrote about
Yes.
religious freedom. I think that would be a really cool touch. And last words. But I'm very excited to get to know you and hope we can connect. And if you're a media person, invite Amanda to come and do an interview with you.
I'd love that. Yeah, I think last words are, I say in the book, it is not, I go into this project eyes wide open. This is a really difficult problem that we are to solve. And if we're going to solve it, we'll only do it by building a coalition that is multi-faith, multi-ethnic, multi-racial. And by doing so, we are living into those values, I think, that are both American values, but also values of religious freedom for all, which unite us across all different kinds of difference. And that's the project that we're really about. And everyone's invited to join us.
That's great. So you are the executive director of the Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty. You're an attorney. You're on X at Amanda Tyler BJC. Follow her on X. I hope you're on Instagram and the other social medias.
We are.
We'll add
We're
all
on,
of those.
yeah, we're on Instagram and on TikTok at End Christian Nationalism as well.
And
So,
Christian nationalism,
yeah.
people. We'll put that all in the blog. And Amanda Tyler, thank you so much for your good work. And I look forward to maybe I can join your coalition and we can do some programs together, because I'm all about what you're advocating, which is, having space to be honest and truthful and have values and care about the separation of church and state and anti-authoritarianism.
That's right. I would love that. I hope that we have more chances to work together. Thank you so much for having me on,
Thank
Stephen.
you. Okay, take care. Steve Hassan here. It's been decades since my family rescued me from the Moonies. I've been at this for over 47 years. The need has never been greater. If you're able, please consider hitting the super thanks button below, and it'll help us to do better. Every penny will help us toward our goal of educating the planet about undue influence. Remember, it's your mind, only you should control it.